Boy, do we have some fun things to talk about for this week, for week 10 of fall semester. We just cover so much information this week. It's been crazy. So to get started, my interfaith class, we talked about your personal ethic. What is it that you believe, or what are some of the concepts and ideas of your beliefs that can help you in facilitating interfaith dialogue? This is a really important thing to consider because when you do interfaith dialogues, when you talk with people of other faiths, you want to realize it's not necessarily about who's right, who's wrong. You want to. There's really two ways to approach it. One is focusing on a common cause that you want to work on. You and them can work together to get something done inside your community. Some help out in some way with the charity or something is great. It doesn't have to be talking with other people of other faiths doesn't have to be about faith, about theology, things like that. And realize it's okay to agree to disagree with people. You may believe something different than them, and that's okay. To have a really good conversation, if you want to talk about faith with other people, you have to go into those kinds of conversations realizing that what you believe in your faith might not be 100% accurate, and maybe they have valid points. So if you're going to do an interfaith dialogue or talk with people about theology, about what you believe and what they believe, understand that what they believe is what they believe, and it's not necessarily your job to change their mind. Also realize that what you believe might not be 100% accurate. And so to truly understand where somebody's coming from, you have to be willing to try on their belief and understand it. That opens you for a little bit of doubt in what you believe. And that's not a bad place to be. That's actually how you learn truth, is take a little bit of time to go, okay, I'm going to try this on like a jacket. Let's just try it on and see how does this work with my other beliefs, with what I think of. And as you do that, you'll see, oh, maybe this does work. Maybe this helps me understand my beliefs better. Maybe it doesn't work with your beliefs. That's okay. Trying it on doesn't mean you accept it. It just means you're testing it, basically. Just trying to see how it feels with everything else that you believe in. But understand the only way to learn is to admit that you don't know everything and that maybe what you think you know isn't completely accurate. So that's one thing to always think about when you're doing interfaith dialogue. It's not about I'm right, you're wrong, we'll just agree to disagree or whatever. But realize it's more about understanding each other. What is it I believe in that you also believe in that we can come together on? What is it that we disagree with that I can try to understand from your perspective? That's building some good bridges and opportunities to come together. But having that open mind, that opportunity to allow them to believe what they believe, you believe what you believe, and we learn to work together is a really important concept to think about when you're doing interfaith discussions or working with other people. And I think this is something we're going to see more in LDS culture and in churches, more ideas of working with other people of other faiths in your community and helping each other out. I think it's going to be a good trend that we're going to start to see emerge and happen here in the near future. So let's jump into my Mormonism class. Man, did we talk about a ton of stuff. Holy cow, a ton of stuff. So I want to get in and go through this, kind of review some of my notes here. So I don't know if you realize, and put in the comments if you realize this or not, but did you realize that there was a slavery act in Utah that was in 1852? So this was an act dealing with slavery in Utah, basically. So this is a great thing for us to be looking at. So this is following this concept of, we've talked about slavery and challenges. Last week we talked about, or not last week, I think it was 2 weeks ago, we talked about the idea of Mormons being slave owners, basically, from the Indians and buying slaves from Indians and things. I'm not going to say slavery is a good thing, but it was something that was very common that they had to deal with and address in their day and age in the 1800s. There's more years in history with slavery than without slavery when you look at it from a very broad historical context. So when the state of Utah was formed and organized, they had to address this issue. What do we do with people who move here from slave states? Now, Utah actually, as a territory, came into the came into the into the United States as a slave territory, basically, because you could have, if you remember our discussion from last week about Nebraska and Kansas, they had to do that, the Missouri Compromise, so 50% of the states could be free states, 50% of states could be slave states, but they wouldn't allow only, you had to join two states at a time so that that balance stayed even between slave states and free states. It was a huge problem. So in the 1800s, you have to realize that the people who are abolitionists, the people who are anti-slavery, which is predominantly in the northern United States, they believed, and there was preachers, there was newspaper articles, lots of information that proved that they believed that God's will is slavery is evil and bad and shouldn't happen. Equally, in the southern half of the United States, those states had preachers and newspapers and periodicals and things that were going out showing with the Bible that slavery was allowed by God and even sanctioned in a way by God. So both of them used God and the Bible to prove their points were true, which leads us to a big problem. Which one is the truth? Where is the truth among those two major arguments? And it was a huge issue. Huge issue that they had. So in Utah, one way they dealt with this was putting an act in place to deal with slavery. And they tried to balance these two out, because if you came across two abolitionists, then the southern states hated you. If you came across as two pro-slavery, the northern states hated you. So it was this problem as Utah, this problem was already in place long before Utah became a state. So they came in as a pro-slave territory because California came in as anti-slavery, but that gave more favorable conditions to Utah becoming a state. There is a great book that we did read from this week, and I'm glad we read from this. I've been wondering when we're going to use this book. If you remember, I did a video several weeks ago about a book called Religion of a Different Color by Paul Reeve. It is a phenomenal book about LDS church history and this idea of slavery and blacks and Indians and things. He does a really good job of shining light in some areas that I've never seen before. It's been awesome. His book, Religion of a Different Color, is absolutely worth reading. If you want to get in and understand Mormon history more, that is a must-read book. In that book, he talks about one of the problems that the saints had as they were in the East before they migrated out to Utah, was because Mormons had a more liberal philosophy when it came to inclusion of Indians and blacks. The Mormons believe Indians were the descendants of the people in the Book of Mormon, and so they saw them as an opportunity to bring them into the faith. Mormons also saw blacks as equally opportunistic as far as they are children of God. They should be allowed into the church. And there's a couple of even black men that had priesthood ordinations in the early days with Joseph Smith. So blacks are now giving equality of religion. They're giving priesthood leadership opportunities. They have a lot more freedom through Mormonism than they do through Protestantism or even just their average everyday life as a slave. So this made a big problem for the LDS Church back then. So they were seen, because of more liberal views on Indians and slavery, as well as their ideas around polygamy. Polygamy was seen as something Indians and people from Africa do. And so because those are considered heathen groups, then Mormons were considered heathen by practice as well. And all this ties into actually really well with what we learned in my graduate class too, which we're going to talk about here in a few minutes. So Mormons were seen as non-white people. And that's what Paul Reeve's book talks about. That was one of the early problems. They're not white enough. They're not white evangelical Christians. they are heathen people because they practice ideas. Yes, they're technically white, their skin is technically white, but they're heathenistic in their practices and therefore they're heathen. So we see them the same, we'd lump in the same category as Indians or indigenous people as well, which is why they got treated so poorly. That was part of the reason. The problem was is when they went west, they established their territory. The government still hated them, and there's a lot of people that had problems against them. And we're going to talk about some of those here in just a minute. But when they wanted to join the United States and be a state, they had to find a way to be accepted. And so realizing they're balancing this idea of abolitionism and slavery. So what Utah did was put this act in place that said basically, okay, slaves are allowed in the state of Utah, but there's a few challenges we want to do. So as a slave owner has property rights to their slaves. So we're not just as soon as you move here, they're completely freed and gone. We're not going to go to that extreme. They tried to find a middle ground in all of the debates and challenges and things that were going on. So in my notes here, it says that what they did is they put a gradual emancipation into this bill. And what that meant is a first generation slave, so somebody who was brought over on the boats and were sold into slavery directly, they're not eligible for emancipation, this graduated emancipation process. They can get out of slavery if they buy their slave owners out, basically pay the debts back. The manumission that we've talked about before with Domingos Alvarez and those books. So they still have that opportunity. Now, if you are a second or third or fourth or subsequent generation of slaves, so the children of the original slaves, they were given an opportunity to be let go much sooner from slavery. And every generation, it was easier and easier because there was a goal of paying back the debt to the slave owner. The original slave could pay that back himself, and all subsequent generations would take what the original slave had done, their parents had done, and add to it to pay the debt back. And as soon as the debt was paid off, they went free. The original slaves, the original, your parents, basically, if you were born to slaves, you could get out of slavery much easier through this Utah law. You still had to be a slave for a while, but once the debt was paid back, you're let go. Your parents, they would not be able to take that opportunity, unfortunately. So original slaves stayed. Slave owners could let them go. Slave owners could sell them to other people. That was up to their choice. But the next generation of slaves, basically, it was easier and easier for every generation to get out of slavery. So over time, slavery just went away, basically, as more slaves had children and they had children. Every generation, it would get easier and easier to get out of slavery, and eventually it just go away, basically. So at least they were moving in that direction to getting to ending slavery in the future. It did ban relationships. You couldn't have, a slave owner couldn't be intimate with their slaves. That was to prevent sexual abuse of their slaves, as well as prevent interracial relationships, because that was a big challenge at the time. Interracial relationships was a huge problem, which kind of extended itself to this idea of dealing with withholding priesthood from blacks. So those were some challenges and ideas that happened that culminated in this idea of blacks in the priesthood and things, which is interesting. I don't know if you've ever looked into this. So in Paul Reeves' book, he gives some really great information about the history of the blacks in the priesthood ban. We're all familiar with the priesthood ban, but why did it happen? Where did that come from? Well, what happened with that was there was a black man who married a white woman, and they lived in the north, up in New England area, and so they were in the area of the country where it was okay for a black man to be free, but interracial marriage was a problem. Even for freed blacks, they still had, a lot of America still had issues around interracial marriage. So that was, even in the North, they didn't necessarily like it a whole lot. So what happened was there was a gentleman who had been a member of the church for several years, not very long, but he was a member of the church. He did a lot of great things, was a really great guy, was a good minister to others, and things were he was a good member of the church. He happened to be assigned to the area of New England as a church leader to help the saints that are up in that area. And so his job was to go around and talk to the saints and encourage them to make sure they're holding church meetings in their local areas and things, and missionary work, and all those things are happening. Well, he goes up there and he happens to find this couple, and he was a little surprised to find this couple were interracially married and Mormons. And because while he wasn't necessarily for slavery himself, I don't think the whole idea of interracial marriage really struck him. So, and this guy held the priesthood. He had priesthood offices. He had the priesthood given to him. He had the certificate and things. So this gentleman, I believe his name was Appleby, was his last name. He wrote a letter to Brigham Young and said, "Hey, I ran into this interracial couple. He's got the priesthood. Is this different than what we were taught before? Am I not correct in my interpretation ideas of what kinds of challenges there are with this? Who's right? What's going on with this? Because this is challenging my views of Mormonism, basically." And so some of the problem that happened with this is when Brigham Young looked at it and wrote his letter back, and they discovered that yes, this man was Joseph Smith asked William, I want to say William Law, but I don't remember for sure if that's him or not. But anyways, Joseph Smith asked another apostle to ordain this gentleman to the priesthood, a black man, and he got the priesthood. And at the time, everybody was okay with that. But again, as time went on, through the Nauvoo era, the Jackson County era, those time periods, attitudes changed because of this idea of interracial marriage and blacks getting the priesthood. So originally, the challenge with the curse of Cain, or the curse of Ham, was a big one that they used, which still kind of the curse of Cain coming through the curse of Ham type idea from Adam and Eve's son Cain, Cain and Abel. Cain killed Abel. Cain gets cursed, and then Ham, Noah's son, becomes cursed as well, and his wife was a descendant of Cain, and those kinds of things. So that's an argument that has been used for centuries by Christian groups all over the world to say, here's why blacks aren't allowed. Here's why blacks are slaves and not full people, and things like that, is this curse of black skin that's upon them. The Mormons accepted it as well, and I'm sure many of you have heard that in your own life as well. Well, back in the 1800s, that was a common thing to think about. And at first, they defined it as slavery was the curse. They were allowed to be slaves because they were cursed. Eventually, priesthood ordination became connected with that curse. I'm not sure exactly how that transition happened. I think a lot of it was people looking back after the saints came west. This was a big issue that happened. And so they had to finally decide, what do we do? In fact, it was when Brigham Young was in winter quarters, he got Appleby's letter of what was going on with this. And so they had to address this issue of what do we do with blacks getting the priesthood. So somewhere around there, people revised some of what they thought they heard Joseph Smith say or other things. And the curse of Ham, the curse of Cain, became connected with priesthood. And so that's when they said, okay, we're not going to allow, they're denied the priesthood. And then that idea fleshed itself out more as people thought about it, that does mean no temple ordinances. That means that the blacks won't get the priesthood until after the sons of Abel get the priesthood. This kind of idea of the whites, once all the white folk get the priesthood through all time, then the blacks can eventually get it. Or that another version of this was that blacks get the priesthood in the next life. They don't get it in this life. It'll all be handled in the next life. You don't have to worry about it. Those were some of the common variations of this idea that came out. So that's where that started from. And a lot of it was people, even the gentleman who ordained this black man, man, I just forgot his name. But anyways, he changed his thoughts. We look at his journal entries and things. he changed his opinion of interracial marriage over time and blacks. And so because the whole country was changing their perspective of these concepts and ideas, a lot of Mormons adopted the culture too and went along with that. Part of it was so that they could help better position themselves to gain statehood by like even accepting slavery and things. And part of it was dealing with the problem that was already there. It didn't start with the Mormons. The Mormons just got handed the problem when they had to figure out, what do we do? Do we side one way or the other, or do we find some middle ground between these two? They went for middle ground basically to help out with that. So that's the best they could. Now, also during this time, after the Saints came west and all the challenges and things were happening here, the Civil War happens. So most of the Mormons are outside the Civil War. What did the Mormons think of the Civil War? A lot of Mormons believe the Civil War was retribution to the country for the murder of Joseph and Hiram. That was God, after the Saints left, now the country could devolve into chaos, and they could all be slaughtered and punished for killing Joseph and Hiram. That was some justification that some people believed at the time. Some looked at it as the beginning of the end times. This is the country imploding on itself so that the government will be broken down, and then we'll eventually go back to Jackson County and occupy our land and build the temple and get ready for the coming of Christ. So they saw this as the beginning of the end of days for the second coming. There were these are kind of the apocalyptic type ideas they saw with the Civil War. Now, what's interesting is, of course, we know none of that really happened. The Civil War happened. It was bad. It was terrible. A lot of people died. But we eventually moved on as a country and moved past it. So we actually spent some time learning about Abraham Lincoln and some of his perspectives and ideas. It was really interesting too. Abraham Lincoln was, of course, the president at this time, and he asked Brigham Young and the members to form a militia and to protect the overland mail, Pony Express overland mail stuff, as well as the telegraph lines, to communicate to the western part of the United States. So they did. They reformed a Nauvoo Legion and got it together and sent it up to get more, to help protect. Well, there was another group in California that ended up forming as well. There was a gentleman in California, Patrick Edward Connor. In fact, he was actually born in 1820 in Ireland, so he's actually Patrick Edward O'Connor. But when he migrated to America, he got rid of the O on his name to just make it Connor. He ended up moving his family to California because of the gold rush. After he moved here to America, he enlisted in the army, fought in some of the Mexican wars and other things like that, and then got out, and went to California and was a part of the gold mine rush over there. When the Civil War broke out, he re-enlisted in the army, and because he wanted to be a part of the Civil War. He was a Unionist, so he favored the Northern Army, not the Southern Army. He was on the northern side. So he because he had prior military experience, they made him a leader of a unit. I think he was a colonel at the time, so he became the colonel, and he had this unit, and he was all excited to have glory and majesty and these big battles and epic stuff in the Civil War. And because he's in California, he's not necessarily in the Civil War. So what they had him do is they stationed him and his troops to help protect the mail and telegraph lines. So he got the boring job in the Civil War. The Mormons had the boring job too. So he ended up coming to Utah with his unit and settling here and using this as a central location to help protect those routes, because he had to protect the southern route that went through Utah down through Cedar City, St. George area, and he had to protect the Oregon route, which came through usually into Salt Lake and then went north from there, or they had to go up and around the Bear Lake area to get around that way. It was just, there's more establishment coming through Salt Lake and then going north up the I-15 corridor, what we would call the I-15 corridor, and then over to Oregon. So that's where he was stationed. Now, one thing about Patrick Connor was he was all American. He was very, very American. He's an extremely patriotic guy. And he saw, just like a lot of people in that day and age, he saw Mormons as anti-American. And so he decided that he was going to make life hard for the Saints. So he decided he's going to move into Salt Lake City with his troops, even though he didn't have to necessarily. He put a base here. He went over to the East Bench area in Salt Lake Valley and established a fort where he and his troops could operate from. That is Fort Douglas. So if you're familiar with the Salt Lake Valley, you know, on the East Bench, still today is an army base, basically a series of offices and things over there called Fort Douglas. That was started by Patrick Connor. So during the Civil War. So he established that mainly so that he could just be a thorn in Brigham Young's side. Patrick Connor decided that he was going to create a newspaper, and he wrote a lot of anti-Mormon stuff in it. He was was making fun of Mormons and harassing them, things. He and Brigham Young kind of had a battle in the papers because there was the Deseret News, which was the Mormon-sponsored paper, and so he put his own paper out to put his own propaganda in there as well. So they kind of had this. He and Brigham never really met that we know of, but he and Brigham in their newspapers would argue against each other. Basically, they were not friends at all. Connor decided that he wanted to ruin Utah. Basically, he decided that he wanted to break the power that Brigham Young had in Utah. He knew he didn't have any authority to force Brigham out of office or anything like that, but he wanted to get popular opinion to force him out. So when they weren't patrolling, him and his units weren't out patrolling to make sure the telegraph lines were okay and the mail was okay, he had his men mining. They mined the Ochre Mountains and the Wasatch Mountains as well. So along the Wasatch Front and the Ochre Mountains, which if you're familiar with the Salt Lake area, the Ochre Mountains are at the south end of the Salt Lake Valley, just below the Great Salt Lake, basically, and it separates south end of Salt Lake County from Tooele County on the other side. This Ochre Mountains is also where the Kennecott copper mine is. It's the second largest open pit mine in the world. And that's where they're mining. They're out looking for stuff, and they find copper, and they find silver and gold and other things. In fact, one of the few operating gold mines in the United States today, controlled by the U.S. government, is on the west side of the Ochre Mountains, just south of Tooele. Basically, Mercer is a little town out there. The mine is still active. You go up there, there is a guard with a shotgun outside and big fences and stuff around it. But that was an old mining town because they found gold on that side. So as they found gold, Patrick Connor put in his newspaper and distributed it to the eastern United States to tell people, guys, the Utah mountains are full of gold and all kinds of precious metals. You need to come out here and mine this. It is amazing what we've got. So he tried to sell and convince people to move to Utah. And his goal was to get enough non-members to move to Utah to politically break the power that Brigham Young and the Mormons had in the politics here in Utah. I don't know if he was really successful at doing that, but it's fascinating that he convinced a lot of people to move to Utah, which did cause some challenges that ended up turning, Utah County kind of became more anti-Mormon settlements, where Salt Lake Valley was more Mormon settlements. Down by Point of the Mountain area and things was kind of the dividing area. But just interesting how that history has worked out. Well, Patrick Connor embedded himself in Utah history in another way. He did also, guy's an interesting guy. He, at the end of the Civil War, his army unit was sent back to California. And he was back there. Well, then they needed help with another army unit to deal with stuff. And so he got reactivated and he came back to Utah with his army unit after the Civil War. And while he was in Utah, back at Fort Douglas doing his things, he actually stationed a group of his armed soldiers like a block away from Temple Square in downtown Salt Lake City, and that just drove the Saints nuts and didn't make him any favors with them either. and he was there for a while. But one of the things that he did while he was at Fort Douglas, and I believe this was a little bit after the war. It could be actually. I'm trying to think. Let me look at my notes. I think it might have been um, during the Civil War that this happened. There is, anyways, so one of the problems that some of the settlers, saints and non-saints, were having was with Indians. A common place for this was in Cache Valley. So Cache Valley is a county in the state of Utah, but Cache Valley actually exists into southern Idaho. So if you go up there, you know, the mountain range that circles the valley goes way up into southern Idaho. So Preston, Franklin, those areas were part of Cache Valley. Franklin, Idaho was the northernmost settlement in Cache Valley for settlers. And the Indians would oftentimes come down and talk with them. And I mentioned this, I think, in the last video or two, in the last week or two, we talked about it a little bit. Patrick Connor was the Army general that was sent to deal with the Indian problem. At least that's how they would have said it back then. So he took his army and he went up and kind of went up and came up around. Instead of coming up through Cache Valley, he went up around the area to kind of come down onto the Indians. It's cold. It's a wintry time. He tried to kind of surprise the Indians, basically. And so the Indians jumped into the ravine and were hiding among the brush and the weeds and things. So when they engaged in battle with Connor's army against the Shoshone Indians in the Bear River Valley area, just a little bit north of Preston, the little town up there is Riverdale, if I remember right. There's a water slide there, hot springs, great place to winter for sure. They were fighting, and the Indians were winning initially because they were so good at hiding among the brush that Connor soldiers couldn't get them. So Connor lost like 10 soldiers pretty quickly. So then Connor broke off some of his army and sent them around to the side of the ravine to basically flank the Indians. And then as his guys pushed forward, the Indians retreated through that ravine. So as they came down and went through the ravine, the other soldiers that were on the flank just had a shooting gallery, basically just picking off these Indians as they came through that area by the river where they had been exposed. After that, they ended up pushing into the Indian camp areas and engaging in hand-to-hand combat with the Indians. Over 250 Indians were killed. Shoshone Indians were killed in what's called the Bear River Massacre. This was Connor's troops. In fact, at one point they said that Connor left the battlefield to go over to where his wounded and dead troops were to talk with them and care for them, and left the rest of his troops to just kind of do what they wanted with the Indians. And so they just kept killing them. It was a massacre. Bear River Massacre is what it was. You can go see it. There's a monument up there and things. In fact, we're coming up on an anniversary of it here pretty soon. That was Patrick Connor that did that, basically. So he was a part of that. It was a crazy time. So anyways, after Patrick Connor started to complain about Mormons wanting to fight him because of some of the antics he had done in Salt Lake Valley, the army went, you know what, we're not interested in you causing a regional war over there, so we're going to disband your troops, go back home, get back to California. And so that kind of assuaded that problem. Shortly after all of that happened, Utah went into what's known as the Black Hawk War. This was kind of a Cold War, if you will, that happened. It's called the Black Hawk War, not because of the Black Hawk Indians, because Chief Black Hawk was where we got this name from. In the Manti area, so central Utah, there was a couple of guys went over the hill to go check on their cattle and found Indians taking them. And Chief Black Hawk was a part of this. They were weeding out some of the cattle for themselves. They had a hard winter and a struggle, and Black Hawk kept telling his people, this next season after the winter, we're going to enjoy Mormon beef. We're gonna take their cattle from them. And they were starving. They couldn't roam around like they used to because of all the settlers. A lot of the game was gone, but it was a very harsh winter as well. So they decided they're just going to take the settlers' cattle as a kind of for themselves. So they got chased. A bunch of settlers got together, chased them up into a ravine. The Indians were able to rally and push back down the ravine and push out the settlers. So that emboldened the Indians to do more of this. And it became, for several years, Indians were raiding cattle ranches to capture cows and cattle. Sometimes they would eat them. Most of the time, they were selling them to other Indians and other groups, basically to make money and to get trade for resources for themselves, to take care of themselves. It turned into this little sub-economy through central and southern Utah to raid and get these cows. So that was the Black Hawk War, basically, is what this was. So the settlers were fighting against these Indians who were trying to steal their cattle, and they're going back and forth. It took several years for this to work out. Trying to capture Black Hawk and trying to get with him, it ended up in another massacre in southern Utah. There's a little town called Circleville, and there's a monument there to the Circleville massacre. What happened was there were some unknown Indians that were hanging out in the Paiute camp, and the settlers found these Indians and they captured them. And one of the Indians tried to escape, and the settlers killed him. And they realized if Black Hawk finds out that we've killed this Indian, he's going to start a war, a bigger war against the settlers, and it's going to be a just a big mess. So they decided, well, we can't let these Indians go, but we can't hold them hostage either, so we'll just kill them all and just bury them and get them out of the way, and no one will know the difference. So that's what they did. They killed all these Indians and let them go that way, basically, and just so Black Hawk wouldn't know about the problem. It took, Brigham Young didn't even know for like 15 or 16 years that this massacre had happened. They kept it pretty quiet in southern Utah down in Circleville. So this is just a crazy time of challenges and problems that were happening. So this is all the things that were going on basically at this time. We learned a little bit about Abraham Lincoln as he got into the war. Abraham Lincoln wasn't he was raised in a Baptist family. Basically, they were Baptists. His parents were Baptist. But he didn't see God necessarily as this divine being. He's like, yeah, God's there, whatever, but I'm not really a practicing Baptist. I'm just a guy. He was more involved in his law practices and more humanistic type ideas. But during the Civil War, he starts realizing and coming to grips with God. If we're right, why isn't God helping us be right? If they're wrong, if they're right, why isn't God giving them the advantage? Neither side seem to have the advantage. And you got to realize, when this is a bit of Civil War trivia for you. When the Civil War started, they thought this would be over in a day. We're going to get our armies together. We're going to fight. The North is right. We have the gospel on our side. Slavery is evil and bad. We're going to go fight. We're just going to dominate, and we're going to wipe them out, and then we're done. In fact, people were coming because of the valley that they had decided to meet at. Basically, there was these hills around them, and so people were coming in their carriages with lunch, having a picnic, watching the battle, because they thought this is going to be the skirmish. We'll get it all solved here on the battlefield. It'll be done. We won't have to worry about it. They thought completely the North was going to win. The South was unorganized. They didn't have a regular army, so they had to organize their own armies and government entities and things like that down there. And so they didn't think the South would ever win. Well, they definitely underestimated the General Jackson, Stonewall Jackson. As the South was retreating, he made his men stand still and just keep fighting. And that rallied the South, and the South ended up pushing the North back. And these people that came out to have a picnic and watch the battle ended up having to flee for their lives because the South did so well. And so it didn't end. Ironically enough, the farmer whose land that they were fighting on, his family was at home in their house when all this was happening. So they're hunkered down inside their house as all this fighting's going on around him. And he decided, I don't want to live here anymore. This is crazy. So he sold his farm off and moved to a town called Appomattox. Bought a house and a farm down there and lived there, basically to avoid the war. His land was not only the Civil War started on his land, but the Civil War ended at his land because his house was also the courthouse in Appomattox. Fascinating that same family, owned the land the Civil War started on and the Civil War ended on, basically. It was kind of little fun fact for you there. But it was during this challenge of the Civil War that Abraham Lincoln came to understand who God was, basically, and started writing down who's favoring what. And that's when he realized that this war is about slavery, and this is the North is needs to abolish slavery. So he waited until they had a really good victory, and then he released his Emancipation Proclamation, and that riled the South up because they saw it as completely bad for them. And that's it, Abraham Lincoln came to know God as a loving God, a Father in heaven that was actively helping his children out, but still not interfering with his children's choices either. And this was a contest that had to be dealt with to deal with slavery. And that's what he said, basically. And that it was really fascinating, his views and ideas on this. So anyways, that was what it was a ton we learned in my the Mormonism North American history class. So a lot of fun stuff, a lot of things going on at this time around slavery and rights for people of other religions and things, or not religions, races. It's so wild how all that worked out. So now let's kind of cap this off and with the discussion of my graduate class. We read this book in my graduate class, Heathen. Now, this is a really fascinating book. If you are a casual person who just likes to kind of watch documentaries on history and doesn't want to dig into the details, if you don't want to get elbow deep in history, this is not the book for you. It is definitely not for you. If you want to really get into history and like understand, deep threads of concepts and ideas and how that shaped history, this is a good book for you. Catherine Lum does a great job with this book. So this is basically what she does is she traces through time this concept of heathen. What makes someone a heathen? How does that term get defined? And she goes back and finds out that this goes back hundreds of years. The idea of heathen was around for a long time. Europeans saw heathens as the people that from Africa and other groups, so the non-white people, non-Christian people were heathen. So the Muslim groups and things were heathens through the Dark Ages and those things. Even in Rome, they saw heathens. A lot of these terms come from Rome. In fact, the word barbarian comes from Roman times, and she talks about that in here. Paganism was the religion that's different than my religion. Barbarian, they were called barbarian because they made this kind of bar type sound when they spoke, and they thought they were uneducated people. So if you read about Romans and you hear them talking about barbarians, they kind of lumped it into all non-Romans. If you are a group of people that does not have an established city, have an established government and arts and sciences and all these things, if you're not civilized, if you're a wandering group of people, you're barbarians. The barbarians a lot of times were the group of people that came from Scandinavia and came down through Europe and ran into Rome about the same time that Genghis Khan's group came over from the droughts and famines that they had in the East, in Asia, and then came over and ran into Rome as well. So that's where these terms came from, are the people who aren't like me type idea. Europe adopts them. Even when Europeans move to America, America ends up adopting them too. And because America is white evangelical as the main thing, even Catholics weren't seen as proper Americans for a while there too. They eventually kind of get in there as this idea of white Christianity. But Indians were heathens, blacks were heathens, all these people were heathens. And so her book traces this idea of heathens through time. It's really interesting because she points out that these heathens are seen as terrible. Like, during the 1700s and 1800s, they tried their darndest to keep blacks from using black religion. If you remember from the book I read several weeks ago in this class, Domingos Alvarez, he comes over using Vodanism, black African American, or not African American, African religious philosophies to heal people and the spiritualism and things. And he goes against the Catholic Church, and so they see him as as an anti-Catholic and things, and it goes bad for him. Eventually, though, in her book, she says that it's when the heathens become policed and controlled by the whites, then they start to realize maybe there's some value in heathens, and that's when acceptance of other religions start to become more tolerated and more ideas start to come out of. Instead of hating the heathens, we start learning about the heathens and think, oh, this is an exotic religion, oh my gosh, and putting it in museums and things like that. Again, is another way to separate, we're this way, you're that way, and you're different. Really fascinating book that she gets into, so we can see these threads and ideas through all these stories of slavery, of interracial marriage, of other things. And she even talks about in here that the concept of heathen kind of gets flipped on its head as we get into late 19th century, early 20th century, because while Americans are worried about saving the children in China that are starving to death, or the children of Africa that are starving to death, there's plenty of white kids starving to death in America, but we're not thinking about them, because that would mean we would have to change ourselves to take care of the people like us. It's easier for us to take care of somebody who's not like us. And so she kind of talks about how philanthropy and humanitarianism, while it has good intention, sometimes causes more problems for these groups than it helps. Um, some of the challenges that go into that, and then even the fact that you're more likely to be a homicidal maniac as a white person than you are as a black person or an Indian. And that some ways their culture that is seen as heathenistic culture is a culture that is more cohesive and connected and less likely to act out, versus white culture, which is very independent, freedom for yourself, and people start making really radical choices that, so she points this out, which is really interesting. She does mention in the book that she, as a Chinese American, she has Chinese heritage, but she is American. She sees herself as us and them at the same time. She comes from the cultural heritage of being a heathen, descendant of heathens, but she's also American too, so she can see it from both sides, which is a really good contrast. So this book is a really good book if you want to see this thread of belief through all of history that kind of ties all these concepts together. It's a really good book for that. And all of us in this class realized that as we read this book, we went, wait a minute, this now helps us think through that book. The last book we read, Gods of Indian Country, where America is pushing out the Indians. Denmark Vesey, his Bible, we read that book several weeks ago. Domingos Alvarez, all of these stories are not mentioned specifically in her book, but what happens to concepts and ideas and beliefs, she talks about. It's a very well researched book. So if you want to really get elbow deep into some serious historical concepts and ideas, this is a good book. It's a little over 400 pages. It's a pretty sizable book, but man, it was a really fascinating book to see this common thread through history. So really interesting ideas that she espouses in there. So it was a good book to read. Again, like it helped us frame all these ideas of these battles and wars and conflicts and challenges that we've been studying and learning about. So even with my Mormonism class talking about slavery and interracial marriage and all these challenges that they had with Indians and blacks and things, all kind of pulls together. And she even mentions in here how Mormons were seen as heathens for a while, which corroborates with Paul Reeves' book, that's one of the reasons people hated Mormons, is they were seen as practicing heathen practices. So they were lumped into the category of being heathens. So just, and it's so fascinating how this term got used throughout history. So a really good book to read. Again, if you're a casual history person, don't want to get into too deep, I wouldn't worry about this book at all. Read the reviews on it and call it good, just because it is a pretty in-depth book, and I don't know if you get bored quick with it, maybe, but if you want to get like deep into history, really want to understand historical concepts and ideas, this is a really good book to read. I would recommend this book to anybody who wants to get serious about understanding history. So that's all my updates for the classes. To give you an update on my final paper I'm writing for my graduate class on the Articles of Faith, I'm actually finally getting into the research part of of pulling what are the tidbits and ideas I can get out for this reception history. So I've compiled all the general conference talks when they have mentioned or used an article of faith to validate a concept or principle they're teaching, whether they're explaining what that article of faith means or they're using an article of faith to validate what they're talking about. I pulled all those together. I went through periodicals, Utah newspapers, magazines, and things, a bunch of those through the 1900s to see what did the average person think, and then I did a survey that I put out a couple weeks ago I think it was 2 weeks ago on the video. I put a link in there for the survey. What do modern people think about the articles of faith? And I've been compiling these things together, and it's really fascinating. Some articles of faith have been used a lot, like article of faith number 11 and 13 get used a ton throughout time. Article of faith number 7, I think it only got mentioned, I only discovered like 6 times in in about 150 years no, actually 100 so General Conference talk starts around 1850-ish time frame with Journal Discourses. So in like 150 some odd years of time, it got used like 6 times, where article of faith number 7 was specifically mentioned. So that was interesting. Article of faith number 2 doesn't get mentioned a lot. I found article of faith 5 and 6 got mentioned quite a bit. Not they don't get mentioned a lot. They're more about like authority and callings in the church and things. They don't get mentioned a whole lot, but I'll tell you what, man, when we hit the 1960s, it explodes they get used a ton. Article number 4 got used a lot in 1960s as well as in 2000. And so it's been fascinating as to why do certain time frames, certain decades seem to just use one article of faith a ton. And so I've dug into some of those and found some interesting ideas. I've learned the 1960s was a very tumultuous time. There's the Vietnam War. There's counterculture ideas. If you think of Woodstock and all those things going on as well, the kind of remnants of Korean War, all those things are happening. A lot of economic disruption as well. It's a time of crazy change. Rivaled probably by the 2020s with COVID and things. And so the church sees a lot of pushback. There was a huge pushback in authority, period. Across the board, government authority, religious authority, any type of authority was being pushed against. And so the church had a lot of talks about authority and the importance of authority and where they get their authority from and things. And so that was interesting. And then in 2000, actually starting in the 1990s and into 2000, the church does a lot more push on authority and the importance of kind of getting back to basics, if you will. And what we see statistically is church membership starts to go for the first time in a decline around the year 2000 and just slowly kind of tapers down from there. The net growth of the church goes negative after 2000 for a while. And I mean, there's kind of ups and downs, but the trend is still going down a little bit. But it's just interesting that, they use certain articles of faith at those times to help reiterate principles and ideas that were important to help people through the challenging times. So really fascinating, some things I'm pulling together. I'm looking forward to putting this report out for people to read. So I actually applied to the Mormon History Association to see if I can present my findings in their June conference in Ogden. So that should be fun. There is a Mormon History Association here in Utah that they talk about all kinds of Mormon history topics and ideas. So kind of a fun thing. We'll see if I get picked for that or not. But yeah, a lot of fun stuff to see how this works out. Article of Faith number 2, while it's not used a lot, is used very different by people than the church used it. Most of the time when Article of Faith number 2 was used was to talk about we don't believe in original sin. We also believe in individual, you got to work out your own salvation, basically. That's more of the official, according to these general conference talks, what the church talks about the most. Most of the times I found Article of Faith 2 brought up by people was in periodicals was showing that doesn't Article of Faith number 2 mean racism is bad? Doesn't Article of Faith also to destroy the concept of the curse of Cain. Why are blacks today being punished for the sins of an ancestor? Wouldn't Article of Faith number 2 mean that's against the law in the church? So the Article of Faith number 2 was used a lot to push against the ban of blacks in the priesthood and racism and those kinds of things as well, through the 50s and 60s and those timeframes also. So that was kind of interesting. That got used a lot. I found out Article of Faith number 8, if I remember right. No, 9. I think it was Article of Faith number 9. The Salt Lake Tribune uses it against the church a couple of times in some commentaries. That was interesting. So just, some fascinating stuff that was out there about how the Article of Faith these faiths have been used and talked about. So I'm almost done looking at evaluating the data and getting ready to start writing the paper. So we're getting to a good spot with that. Yeah, really fun things we're learning and talking about. So I hope this video helps you to get just kind of a good synopsis of ideas and helps you even learn more about Utah history, Mormon history, and other types of concepts in history as well. So if you like these videos, please hit the like button on it to like the video. Subscribe to the channel to keep getting the updates every week on these, as well as our daily videos. We're in the New Testament, going through the New Testament right now. So if you have comments or questions, feel free to put them in the comment section. We'll have a greater discussion there. What do you think? Were you aware of these laws around slavery that was in Utah during the early Saints period? Or is this brand new Mormon history for you? Does this change anything in your mind about Mormon history or not? It was definitely it's not a very simple time. Very convoluted, lots of conflicting problems and challenges and things. And I think the Saints did the best they could to navigate through it. I can't say they did it perfectly. In hindsight, we can look at things and say that maybe should have been done different. But when you put yourself in the moment, it's all they had. And I think they did at least a decent job of getting through it. But thankfully, things have been improved over time, and we've gotten better at stuff since then. So again, thanks for watching. Share these videos out with others. Encourage them to come watch our scripture videos as well. And we'll talk to you next week.